Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 81 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Janir slammed to the stone, forced down by the creature's impossible weight. Already the essence's legs and hips had disappeared below the pool's surface, his face twisted in ire. "You will fall with me," he growled. Even in the screeching wind, his voice was unmistakable. "Janir!" Carlisle cried. The enchanter snatched the sword from Janir's other hand. He hefted it above his head and swung it down, landing on the essence's forearm. A deafening boom, like a clap of thunder, broke from Mulvren's mouth as a deep gash severed muscle and tendons. Copper blood poured out, but still, the creature would not let go. If anything, his grip tightened. Janir clawed and clung to the stone with everything that was in her, struggling, fighting, resisting, battling to stay on this side of the portal. People shouted, and figures tried to force their way through the whirlwind, but they wouldn't get there in time. Carlisle raised the sword again and again. He hacked until they both heard the sickening tear of sinew and the snapping of bone. Blood like molten iron gushed out the stump of Mulvren's arm. His arm dropped at the elbow and disappeared into the roiling pool. But even the loss of his limb didn't stop him from lunging for Janir. He fell short, but his orange blood splashed her hand. It seared her palm like fire and blinded her with the pain. Carlisle yanked her backwards by her collar, hauling her from the pool's edge, as Mulvren was swallowed up. Janir clutched her hand against her chest, trying not to scream. Her flesh seared and ached. She crawled with her other hand, groaning as Carlisle did his best to help her move out of the wind's current. Indistinct figures seized them both and hauled them back, dragging them to safety. Janir was in too much pain to know who it was. Mulvren's voice boomed through the stone, the air, the very blood in her veins. There were no words, only a mad cry of untempered fury. Then the winds stopped. All was quiet again. There were only the smashed bodies to show anything had happened at all. Carlisle and Janir huddled on the floor, panting. The Lord Argetallam shouted. A messenger went scurrying off. Seovan was beside them a moment later and said something distinctly rude to Cerilius. The Mortan responded in kind as they took up opposite sides of Janir. Janir unwrapped her good arm from around Carlisle and winced, glancing down to her left hand. "Janir, let me see," Carlisle urged, keeping his voice down. Reluctantly, she uncurled her fingers, showing a large, hard splash of what appeared to be metal on her palm. It had already hardened into a silver splotch, melded against her skin, burned into it. Though the metal, blood, whatever it was, had now cooled, her flesh still throbbed. Seovan swore. "Janir, did it touch you anywhere else?" He rested a hand protectively on her shoulder. "What is that?" Cerilius gaped, one hand on his carcatan. "No, this is it." Janir groaned in response. Carlisle glanced once to the pool, then back to her. "Janir, I'm sorry, but we have to get it off you." He gently took her hand in his own, trying not to hurt her, but not doing a very good job. "Do you trust me?" Janir bit her lip and nodded, not wanting to show him just how painful this was. Out of the corner of her eye, Drusilla and the Lord Argetallam marched toward them. Seovan slipped an arm around her and pulled her against his chest. She pressed her cheek against him, looking away from Carlisle. "Okay." The enchanter took a deep breath. "Hold on." As quickly as was humanly possible, he jammed his fingers under the edge of the hard disc. Janir choked on a scream and doubled over, tears of pain springing from her eyes. It took every ounce of self-control to keep from yanking away from him. Carlisle ripped it off, taking a patch of her skin with it. He threw it straight into the pool where it bubbled and hissed before melting away.
"You're all right."
Seovan cradled her against him.
"It's all right."
Janir whimpered. Reflex made her want to close her hand, but it hurt too much.
"Hush,"
Seovan whispered, letting her tears of pain fall into his shoulder. She was so glad he was all right, so glad he was still here to hold her. But at the back of her mind, she was already dreading what her father would do to him for her subversion. "I think that's it," the enchanter announced. "Looks like there isn't any of his blood left behind." Carlisle continued to examine her hand, but a moment later, Velasquez pushed him aside, jostling her wound as he surveyed her palm. Janir couldn't bring herself to look. She had felt Carlisle rip off a piece of her skin, and she had no desire to see the damage. Velasquez didn't even have time to speak his opinion when someone else roughly shoved him aside. Janir squirmed and pressed her face deeper into Seovan's shoulder, even if she hadn't recognized his shadowy presence. Seovan's rigidity and the way he tightened one arm around her would have told her who it was. "It's just a burn," the Lord Argetallam announced. Seovan stroked her back, but Janir was sure he was watching her father with pure hatred. She could only wonder if her father was watching back. Without warning, the ground rumbled. Seovan abruptly jerked Janir to her feet, and she was surprised to see the pool beginning to fold in on itself. She watched, in wide-eyed horror, as the floor cracked and crumbled, falling into the cistern. The corpse of the dead priest tumbled in, sizzling and disappearing. "Fall back," the Lord Argetallam cried. "Run!" shrieked Carlisle. Pieces of crystal began raining from the roof. Shards stabbed down like arrowheads. Janir covered her head with her arms, and people scrambled and ran. Dust fogged the air, and the lamps smothered, leaving them in almost total darkness. Seovan grabbed her arm and yanked her to one side of the dome. On his other side, he had Carlisle by the collar. Janir heard her father and Cerilius calling her name, but she didn't answer. Going back now would only make Seovan stop, and that would endanger them all further. But then, wasn't she letting her father and Cerilius risk their lives too? She didn't think she should feel so guilty over her father, but Cerilius? She hated the thought of him being harmed. The same for Lucan. She said a quick prayer, asking that they be kept safe, and moved on.
"Do you have her?"
Armandius wheezed. He slumped against the wall with Lady Gwenna at his side. "I'm here," Janir assured him, letting him grasp her uninjured hand just a moment.
"We need to get out of here,"
Velasquez shouted as large chunks of ceiling began to shake the floor. Seovan released Janir after making sure she was fit to run, and went to help Velasquez with Armandius. They each slung one of his arms over their shoulders and hastily shuffled after Luana. Lady Gwenna followed close behind, while Janir and Carlisle brought up the rear. No one chased them. It seemed the chaos of the earthquake had created enough of a diversion. Janir could only hope the Morsanes wouldn't take this opportunity to attack. Luana found a passage leading out of the dome, probably thanks to her heightened sylvan senses. They came to a poorly lit corridor that twisted and turned, yet Luana never hesitated. The chaos of the chamber, coupled with the darkness, cloaked their escape, giving them the chance. Janir's palm ached with a sharp throb not unlike a Carcotan blister. She had trouble focusing as she blindly followed after the others. Carlisle's hand on her arm steadied her steps. She shouldn't have been this weakened by a simple burn. She was heady and dizzy, and she could swear her veins were too hot. Had she been poisoned by Mulvrin's blood? The ideas that came to mind were too sickening to dwell on, so she pushed them to the back of her mind. She would think on the possibilities later. She was aware of them running past screaming acolytes and frightened servants, but in the dark, every passage blended into the next. All the lamps winked out as the earthquake continued, rattling the temple to its foundations. Whatever had happened, It was all but destroying the monastery. Janir wondered how those back at the dome fared. Had they gotten away? Were they safe? She hoped so. Truly. Luana led them uncannily into the stables. They were deserted. The servants must have abandoned the stables after the first tremors hit. It wasn't difficult for them to find the horses. Kolbo whinnied for Janir, and the elven steeds did much the same for their riders. Near the back of the stall, a lantern fell into a pile of straw, and the stack was ablaze in moments, sending the animals into a panic. Janir hurried to slip inside Kolbo's stall. She wished they could release the other trapped horses, but there wasn't a moment to spare. The tremors had grown so violent, Janir feared that the whole of Tarkoth would come crashing down at any second. The stallion stamped and snorted, but calmed as she stroked his neck with her good hand, while Karail helped her pull a bridle over his head. With no time to find their gear or properly saddle their horses, they had to make do in some cases. Halters and lead ropes tied to either side as reins. Lady Gwenna was pulled up behind Seovan on Laristi, and Velasquez supported the weakened Armandius as they tore out of the burning stables. Luana led the way once again, her Cremello steed pounding ahead. They galloped into the courtyard crowded by screaming temple residents, all trying to force their way across the drawbridge. The drawbridge had been lowered, and people were spilling into the rainforest as the temple's foundations shuddered. Their horses barreled their way through the throng, no matter how their riders attempted to rein them in. Janir cringed as Kolbo's shoulder impacted with a guard, knocking the man aside. She could only hope that the soldier was able to regain his footing before he was trampled by the mob. The stallion's body was tense beneath her, and he chomped the bit in his mouth. If Janir hadn't been holding him back, he would have gladly plowed over everyone in his path. Chunks of roof and pieces of balcony tumbled into the river, but still didn't collapse. At this point, it was anyone's guess as to whether or not the structure would hold. A flash of red-hot magic lit the road before them. The flare was almost overwhelming. The horses careened to a halt, their riders flung to the ground by the force. Janir could hardly tell what was happening. Her hand had been crushed when she fell, and it was all she could do not to cry. Kolbo whinnied and stomped his hooves, standing above her. The other horses did much the same thing. Karail had sprung up and stood gripping their reins like a madman. Zamarza stormed from the darkness, screaming acolytes and servants parting around her. Auburn hair and alabaster skin glowed crimson, power emanating from her like lightning. Luana drew her sword, but Zamarza flicked her wrist, sending the sword careening into the night. None of that. The enchantress growled, so softly it was almost a purr. There should have been no way for Janir to hear the words over the screaming, but she did. Velasquez drew his sword. The enchantress flicked her wrist, and the elf was tumbling head over heels into the wall. The stream of fleeing bodies thinned, and the trembling of the temple eased. Still, the precarious slanting of the walls promised the entire palace could collapse at any moment.
Father,
Seovan cried.
I am fine,
Velasquez muttered, stumbling to his feet. Zamarza wagged a finger at Luana as the elf woman reached for her dagger. None of that. Reluctantly, Luana removed her hand from the hilt of her blade, never once taking her eyes off the other woman. Karail scrambled to Janir, clutching Agu's reins. He leaned over. I don't suppose there's a chance you smuggled out your Carcotton? Janir shook her head. Karail gnawed his lip. We need to do something. Just what could they do? At their backs, most of the palace people had already fled. Janir almost jumped as she sensed the black presence of Argetallam's marching closer. At the moment, her invulnerables were still on the other side of the wall, but they were moving fast and would be here in moments. If Seovan, Karail, Armandius, and the others were caught again, Janir didn't trust the Lord Argetallam would let them go. Zamarza stepped toward Armandius, that red glow bathing her like the light of rubies.
Have you been hurt?
What took you so long? Armandius growled, glaring up at the enchantress. Blood soaked his tunic, but he still found it in him to glare at the enchantress.
What do you want with us?
Gwenna's voice cracked, a cross between a plea and a command. Zamarza glanced in the direction of the noblewoman. Gwenna had been thrown to the ground along with Seovan when Laristi skidded to a halt. She knelt, facing the enchantress. Zamarza took in Gwenna's ripped gown, her soiled clothes and unkempt hair. The enchantress's lip curled.
Leave her out of this,
Armandius coughed, groaning and clutching his side.
I've never been the jealous sort,
Zamarza clipped. I scried you two, that night,
but I don't care.
Armandius said something about an insane harlot as a second bout of coughing overtook him. Gwenna knelt beside him.
What do you want from me?
Armandius sputtered between coughs.
A son, more specifically yours,
Zamarza answered offhandedly.
To replace the one you took from me.
I had no choice, Armandius wheezed, clutching his side. You conceived him as a weapon against me, against Brevia. You would have...
You assumed that,
Zamarza snarled.
You thought the worst of me, and he paid the price.
Velasquez looked to Armandius, but the High Lord didn't answer. Seovan met Janir's gaze and shook his head. Zamarza reached for Armandius, and Janir felt the flare of magic in the woman's fingertips. There wasn't time for Janir to think. She needed to act. Janir dove for Zamarza, grabbing her outstretched arm. The enchantress swung for Janir with her free hand, but Janir caught it midair as a black spell washed over her, harmlessly. Zamarza's eyes widened and she tried to pull back as she realized who had a hold of her. She grappled and pulled, but Janir grabbed her throat. Don't move! Janir screamed, wrapping her own magic around them both like a cocoon. Janir could sense the delicious heat of Zamarza's restrained spells. All that power. It would be so easy to reach out, to take it, to crush it. Red glittered and sparked all around them. Zamarza stood motionless, wide-eyed and speechless at the realization of who held her throat. The Argetallams came into view, pouring out the main palace keep. Janir's heart raced. Cerilius was at their head. In moments, they would swarm the gate and everything she loved would be in her father's hands once more. Get them out of here. Get them out of here, Janir whispered. Seovan, Armandius, Carlisle, Gwenna, Velasquez, Luana, and their horses too. See them to the other side of the bridge.
What?
Zamarza swallowed, her throat moving beneath Janir's grip.
You want to save Armandius?
You don't know half of what he's done. I don't know him at all. Not anymore. But it doesn't matter.
Janir,
Seovan shouted. Stay back. Janir screamed, not turning from the enchantress. Zamarza, do it. She pulled back her own power just enough to let a sliver of the other woman's magic through. I know you can. Chin up, Zamarza extended a hand. Do I need to tell you what will happen if... I'm not that stupid. Zamarza's nostrils flared. Janir waited. She didn't have to wait long.
Janir, what are you?
Seovan faded, rippling away like smoke. Seovan faded, rippling away like smoke. The stomping horses with Carlisle holding their reins disappeared after him. Armandius and Gwenna followed, then Velasquez and Luana. It happened in barely the space of a heartbeat, so fast Janir barely caught it. No sooner had they disappeared than Janir sensed them again, if farther away. Carlisle's flickering magic with the elves' dappled light. On the far side of the bridge they sputtered, but they were fine. She could just see them standing up by the moonlight. They would live. Janir, Cerilius shouted. Let go of her.
Janir.
Seovan and Carlisle yelled from the opposite side of the bridge. The enchanter dropped the horse's reins and Seovan stumbled to his feet. The two of them rushed back toward the bridge even as the Argetallams were closing in on her. In a flash of stark realization, Janir saw only one option. Bring it down. She clenched Zamarza's throat tighter. I said, bring it down. There was still a good 50 paces between the Argetallams and Janir and Zamarza. That was more than enough space for Janir to hurt the enchantress before help ever came. Zamarza had no choice. The bridge cracked and splintered, fissures running down the length in an instant. The last stragglers rushed to make it, and Janir looked away. She prayed they made it as the first section of stone fell away. The ancient stones broke apart with seeming ease, crumpling into the river below. A mighty splash swallowed up the rocks, white spray shooting into the air. When the water cleared, Seovan and Karail stopped short at the gorge's cusp. Janir couldn't tell if the people who had been on the bridge made it or not. She didn't dare wonder. Run and never come back, Janir ordered Zamarza, pushing the other woman away. The chalice is gone. We both know what my father will do to you now. Run. Zamarza touched her throat where Janir's hand had left a red mark. You're letting me go? This once. Don't ever let them see you again. Janir nodded to where Seovan and Karail stood with the others on the far side of the river. She flinched as Cerilius's fist closed around her arm. And don't let any Argetallams find you again. Silently, the enchantress watched the girl before her as Cerilius dragged her back. Seize her, Cerilius bellowed, pointing to the woman in red. Never looking away from Janir, Zamarza rippled out of sight. Cerilius's Argetallams grabbed at thin air, cursing. Janir was alone, with her own kind, in the ruined courtyard. Those few acolytes and palace servants who remained scuttled away to hide. Cerilius heaved a sigh. Always find a way to save your friends, don't you? He released her, shaking his head. Janir didn't reply. Across the river, Seovan and Karail were shouting. Armandius struggled vainly against Velasquez. Go! Janir screamed. Just go! I will find you, Seovan swore. I will come for you. Janir battled tears as Cerilius led her back toward the palace. That was one promise she hoped Seovan wouldn't keep. Now we just have to find a way out of this hellhole, Cerilius muttered. Come along. This time he didn't take hold of her. Where would she run? The Lord Argetallam promised their safety for your compliance. So long as you give that, and they remain in their place, everything should be fine. Was he trying to console her? The ranks of honor guards closed around her, and she sensed the dark presence of her father pacing inside the keep ahead. Unless she was mistaken, Lucan was also with him. They were both well. They were both safe. The fires still burned the stables, but the blaze didn't appear to be spreading. Wounded, dying, and dead servants moaned along the walkways, but the Argetallams ignored them. Janir's chest wrenched to see the carnage, realizing it was, in a way, her fault too. She should have had Zamarza transport the enchanters and their servants out of the temple too. She hadn't been thinking. And those people who'd been on the bridge? Janir had just killed dozens, if not hundreds. Once again, she hadn't meant to do it. What happened? The Lord Argetallam demanded. He stormed out of the keep, Lucan on his heels. Why is the bridge down? Explain. Zamarza collapsed it before disappearing. Cerilius began. I made her do it. Janir closed her eyes. I made her transport Seovan and the others too. There was the sense that Janir was sealing her own death warrant, but it would be worse if her father heard the truth from someone else. And then you let her go. The Lord Argetallam's voice shook ever so slightly. Janir lowered her head. Yes. How do you manage it? His boots scuffed against the stone as he turned to someone else. I'm at a loss. He stomped once. They're still watching, aren't they? From the other side? Janir didn't dare look, but she was fairly certain Seovan and the others remained. They could probably still see through the ruins of the gate. That pair cared for her, too much to simply abandon her, if she knew them well enough, Velasquez would have to force the others to flee. You didn't defy me, nor did you truly betray me, the Lord Argetallam growled. But you did go against my wishes. Heart pounding, Janir kept her head down. Look at me, Janir. Taking a deep breath, she obeyed. No sooner had she looked up than a carcatan rammed into her side. But she didn't scream. If she screamed, Seovan and the others would hear. If she screamed, there was nothing that could persuade them to leave, nothing that could stop Seovan and Carlisle clawing their way back into the temple. Her teeth ached and her nose dripped blood, but she didn't make a sound. The blow itself was enough to knock her to her knees, but the instant the rod's fire slammed into her veins, she thought she would faint. The Lord Argetallam's carcatan struck her jaw, her shoulder, her hip, her neck. The blows fell one after the other, bruising and leaving black welts in their wake. Janir gasped on the ground, her jaw swelling and her vision streaked with black. Choking, she wasn't sure she could scream anymore. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of Cerilius, stepping toward her father. My lord. Lucan shot out an arm to stop him, hissing something into the other man's ear. Cerilius waited motionless with the prince, fists clenched and eyes wide. The Lord Argetallam rammed a carcatan straight into Janir's back. The force threw her to the ground, pinning her in place. Janir's hands skipped over the broken cobblestones, convulsions seizing through her whole body. The carcatan's keen rose over the courtyard, deafening and unrelenting. The stare of every Argetallam Morton and Mortana gaped at her and her father. Humiliation burned almost as painfully as the Lord Argetallam's beating. Not a one of them looked away as her blood splattered the stones. Still, she didn't cry out. The Lord Argetallam's boot struck her side and flipped her on her back. No sooner had she eagled on the ground than his carcatan smashed into her sternum. Something cracked, and the carcatan wailed louder than ever. The Lord Argetallam drove the rod down until Janir was sure it would crush her heart. He jerked it free with a snap, nearly jumping 2 steps back. Janir rolled onto her side, coughing black blood and struggling to breathe. The burns Amila had given her had ripped open again, and countless welts burned along her body. Across the river, the shore was empty. Seovan, Carlisle, and the others were gone. She could only hope that they had reached safety. In her state, she couldn't focus to try sensing their magic. The Lord Argetallam's carcatan hung limp at his side, his brow wrinkled just enough that Janir noticed. Without warning, he whirled around and retreated to the temple keep. Several guards rushed to follow him, and he didn't look back. He made for the temple with quick, hasty steps, almost a run. It was so unlike the calm, collected man he presented to the world. My lord, Cerilius called after him. We leave at dawn, was all he said. Shaking, Janir pushed herself onto her good hand. Tears of pain slipped quietly down her cheeks. She kept her head down, the sensation of being judged weighing under the stares of the Argetallams. See her ready to travel, Cerilius ordered before marching after his lord. If Lucan lingered, Janir didn't see him. 2 Argetallam Mortanas lifted her to her feet without a word. The others couldn't seem to stop staring. Seovan, Carlisle, Luana, Velasquez, Armandius, and Gwenna had gotten out of the keep safely. Even with Armandius's weakened state, they had a sufficient head start to get them back to the Brevian outpost before they were caught. Whatever secrets lay between the High Lord and the Enchantress, Zamarza shouldn't be a threat now. They were safe, at least. As Janir was hauled back into the painfully silent temple, she struggled to remain quiet. She had agreed to become the heir her father desired. Whether or not she could keep that bargain, she wasn't sure. But she would try. For the sake of what was in Brevia, she would try. Even if it cost her life, it was a price she had agreed on long ago.
You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley.
Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.